All right, my name is John Speth. I'm an archaeologist from the University of Michigan, and I'm being interviewed actually at the University Indian Ruin, or UIR, which is a wonderful facility owned by the University of Arizona in Tucson. And the date is May 7, 2021. I'm here for most of this current term. We got here, my wife and I got here in late February, early March, and we'll be here until midsummer. She's the visiting scholar and I'm the trailing spouse this time, but it's a wonderful place to do research, or to read, and to just enjoy the desert. At any rate, I'll talk a little bit, I guess, to start off with how I got into archaeology. It's a field I have always loved. I don't know where the interest came from, but I do vaguely remember looking for arrowheads in northeastern Pennsylvania when I was about 6 years old. I had no idea what an arrowhead really was, and I don't know why I was looking for them, but for some reason I went off in the woods, found a spring, and found what I thought was an arrowhead, and my mother convinced me it wasn't. But I still maintain that interest. My parents were really wonderful about this interest, which continued and grew. They had no interest in archaeology or in any kind of history, really. But their attitude was, if I liked what I was doing, I should do it. And later on, when I actually became a professional archaeologist, they never really understood why anybody would pay me to do it, but so long as I was happy and I earned an income, that was fine with them. My mother's attitude towards archaeology, and this came up over and over and over again, which sort of reflected what she thought about it. She would say, you know, Mrs. So-and-so asked me about what you do, and I honestly couldn't remember. And so tell me what you do. And so I would say, well, I'm excavating a Pueblo site in southeastern New Mexico that dates to, let's say, 1300. And she would stop me right there and say, oh, they were already building cathedrals in Europe by then. So that was the end of that conversation. And then I would say, well, I'm also working with Neanderthal materials that date to about 50,000 years ago. And she would stop me and say, well, you can tell me anything and I have to believe it. When I was an undergraduate, that sort of response was a bit frustrating, but it ultimately became a source of humor for both of us, because she could never remember what I did, but and it was either something that was beyond her belief. I don't mean religious belief or anything, simply that it was too old to, you know, how could you possibly know that stuff? Or it was so young that, you know, they were already building cathedrals in Europe. So we joked about it, and that was the end of that. Now, the way I got into archaeology was, as I say, I had an interest in it and no idea where it came from. But the next stage in this was, and a lot of my career, you'll see this as I talk more about this, is or has been dumb luck. None of it's been planned. And it started, really the next major phase started as a Boy Scout. I was living in northeastern Pennsylvania in a very rural area called Lake Winola. And to give you an idea of how rural, my graduating high school senior class, I didn't stay there through my senior year, but if I had, the graduating class was 16 students. So you can get an idea, it was pretty rural. At any rate, I joined Boy Scouts probably when I was about 10 or 11, and they had a scout camp in the Poconos. And I went to that scout camp, and we went on a hike. It started to rain. The leader of the hike took us to a rock shelter. It was along a river, the Lehigh River. Beautiful area, remote, no houses around, quite a few miles from anywhere. And we went in the rock shelter to wait out the rain. While we were in there, the hike leader, who was also the camp leader or director, said, you know, you might poke around. This was an Indian site, and maybe you'll find an arrowhead. So we all poked around, and perhaps the most critical thing was that I didn't find anything. Maybe if I'd found something, that would have been the end of those interests. But at any rate, I found nothing, but others did. So then the rain stopped, we finished the hike, and went back to camp. And again, I can't tell you why, but I went to the camp leader and said, I want to go back and dig in that rock shelter. And something happened then that probably could no longer happen because we're so hung up now on insurance and all these other issues. He said, you know, it actually is an Indian site. It was excavated back in the teens, around 1919 or thereabout. It was excavated by a guy named Max Schrabisch, and he published on it, and I just happened to have his report here at camp. And he loaned it to me, and the next day I asked him, can I go and dig? And he said, yes. So long as you're here for flag raising and back by the time they take the flag down, you can spend your entire camp time digging in that rock shelter. And I did. And that's basically the way I spent my first season in scout camp. And I went back again the next season and continued digging. Then I got my father to take me to that rock shelter, and I continued digging there. And to be totally honest, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I knew nothing about stratigraphy. I knew nothing about grid squares. But I recognized that there was a ceramic level, there was a pre-ceramic level, and so I continued digging. I wasn't screening. It was, you know, kind of sad in a way, but then my parents had a copy of National Geographic sitting on their coffee table, and the cover story was about a cave that was being excavated in northern Alabama called Russell Cave. Early 1950s or mid 1950s, I wrote to National Geographic and said, I'm digging in this rock shelter. I want to know more about how to dig. And to my amazement, they actually answered my letter and said they simply photographed the excavations. The real excavation was directed by a guy named Carl Miller at the Smithsonian, and they forwarded my 12-year-old or 13-year-old letter to Miller, who responded, and he then began to identify my material. He told me how to excavate, and finally in high school I wrote to him and said, how does one actually become an archaeologist? By then I was living in New Jersey. And he said, go to the University of New Mexico and take their summer field school. So I applied, and instead of graduating from high school, or at least instead of attending the official graduation ceremony, I skipped town and went to New Mexico and dug at a place called Pottery Mound, south of Albuquerque. And in a sense never looked back, although there were some deviations. In high school, you have to bear in mind this was the 1950s, the late 1950s, and the Sputnik era. And I told my high school counselors I wanted to be an archaeologist, and they said I was crazy. Nobody becomes an archaeologist. That's not a serious profession. You got to become an engineer. And I'd always been interested in electronics. I was an amateur radio operator and so forth. And so I applied to the University of Colorado. I'm not sure quite why I picked Colorado, maybe because it had the shortest application. At any rate, I was accepted in electrical engineering. But I had already done this dig in New Mexico, so my heart was not in engineering, despite Sputnik. I stayed one semester in Boulder. It was too damn cold anyways. We had snow in September, and I thought, no, not for me. So I, after one semester, left Boulder, transferred to the University of New Mexico, and that's where I then finished my undergraduate work. I triple majored while I was there because I could never make up my mind exactly what I wanted to do. I loved all these fields, and I triple majored in biology, geology, and anthropology. And I kept changing fields depending on who was the most exciting professor that I had. If I had a great lecturer in geology, I became a geologist. The next semester, I may have had a really boring person, but a great one in anthro, so I switched. Eventually, I decided to do all three. And then, I don't need to go into the details, but during that period, the anthro department hired as a chair a guy named John Campbell, who was an Arctic archaeologist. And for those familiar with archaeology, he's the one who ultimately brought Lou Binford to New Mexico. But when I was there, Binford hadn't arrived yet. Campbell decided he wanted me to go to the University of Michigan. I had never heard of the place. He said, you got to go and study with Jimmy Griffin. I had never heard of Jimmy Griffin. But he said, if you want a letter of recommendation from me, that's where you're going. So I went to the University of Michigan, and again, it turned out to be a great choice, and that's where I ended up doing my graduate work. But like these prior things, none of this was planned. I didn't plan on going to the University of Michigan. I would have had trouble finding Michigan on a map at the time, and coming from the Southwest, that was kind of like going to the moon. But at any rate, at Michigan, I still had these issues of what profession or what area of archaeology I wanted to specialize in. I was interested in geology, so I did a lot of Pleistocene geology. That was one of my interests. But I was also still taking courses in other fields. Early on, a Mesoamerican archaeologist at Michigan named Jeff Parsons invited me to participate in a project at Tikal. So I thought, okay, I'll become a Mesoamericanist. And then that part of his grant that would have funded my trip to Guatemala was cut out of the proposal for budget reasons. And so I didn't go to Tikal and become a Mesoamericanist. At that point, Arthur Jelinek, who was at Michigan at the time, got a grant to start an excavation at a Neanderthal site in Israel called Tabun. And the next thing I knew, I was doing Neanderthals in the Near East. So early in my graduate career, I shifted from possibly becoming a Mesoamericanist to working at Tabun in Israel with Arthur Jelinek. And there was a fantastic project, and I got really interested in Neanderthals. The only problem with the project from my point of view was that, and this is not a criticism at all of what Jelinek was doing at Tabun, but it was clear that it would be many, many years of painstaking excavation before I'd have enough material to write a dissertation. And being sort of anxious or in a hurry or something, I decided to strike off on my own, and I submitted an NSF proposal to go and dig a cave in Iran called Kunji Cave that had been tested by Frank Hole and Kent Flannery, I think about 1960. I may be off a little bit on that date. And I got the grant, and I went to Iran in 1969 to dig a Neanderthal site of Kunji Cave, located in southwestern Iran, not far from the Iraqi border. A beautiful place, a fantastic experience, and the cave I refer to as a Pleistocene milkshake. It had been riddled, utterly riddled by porcupines, and I could see there was no dissertation in it. Alcohol was illegal in Iran under the Shah, so it was hard to get drunk, but it was a pretty desperate time because I found myself I had elaborate plans of doing a spatial analysis. In those days, in the 60s, we were talking about living floors and analyzing spatial distributions, and what I would be analyzing would have been the behavior of porcupines. And so I abandoned that and came back to Ann Arbor and decided in a sort of anal compulsive manner to do the ultimate lithic analysis. And this is in the old days of IBM punch cards, for any of you old timers who remember what they were. 80 column cards that you typed out on a key punch and then fed into a computer. I had 18 cards per flake for every item I had excavated, every Neanderthal tool that I excavated in that Pleistocene milkshake. But I decided, so I had, in addition to length and width and thickness and platform angle and on and on and on with any attribute you could possibly cook up, I decided, thank goodness, to do a trial run to see what I got, what sort of results I would get from all this numerical data. And I proved that length was correlated with width and that they both were correlated with weight. And at that point, I didn't throw the tools out, but I threw all the database out. It was an utter waste of time. And there I was without a dissertation topic. And then Henry Wright, who was on the faculty at Michigan, asked me a question. And the question was, what is the bulb of percussion? Because I had measured the bulbs, how thick they were, and all kinds of other features. And I wondered, I didn't know what a bulb of percussion was. It was on every flake, but so I started going into the brittle fracture literature and ended up doing a library topic. My dissertation was probably one of Michigan anthropology's shortest dissertations. I think including the cover, it was about 86 pages long, a lot of math formulas on brittle fracture. And after that, I went in the job market, and I'm again dumbfounded that anybody giving a job talk about brittle fracture got a job, but I managed to get a job at Hunter College in the City University of New York. So there I was, but I had no database, if you like, no real interesting material to fall back on. So my publication record right from the get-go was pretty meager. I did publish a paper in Science, I think it came out in 1976, on seasonality at Olduvai Gorge. It was purely based on library work. I knew nothing about fauna. I knew nothing at that point, absolutely nothing about fauna. I knew nothing about Olduvai Gorge, but it interested me. I worked with some of the published data. It obviously had nothing to do with brittle fracture. So I was kind of drifting. It was a rough way to start. Hunter had a very heavy teaching load, but I managed to get tenure. I'm not quite sure how or why, but this was in the period 1975-76. And right in that period, the entire city and City University of New York went bankrupt. In that same period, I was just before I got tenure, I was drafted as department chair, which is truly bizarre to be an untenured assistant professor made chair of the department. And right after I was made chair, the entire city of New York and the City University went bankrupt. And my job was to increase everybody's teaching load by one course. I had to fire one faculty member that we had just hired who had not even set foot on the campus. I had no administrative experience at all. I had no clue what I was doing. It was a horrendous experience. At the end of it, for some reason, again, it was a miracle, James Griffin came to New York and said that he had been sort of commissioned by the rest of the faculty at Michigan to make me a job offer. So I kind of fired myself from the university, from Hunter College in the City University, and went back to Michigan. The only problem was it was a position in North American archaeology, and I had never even had a graduate level course in North American archaeology. So my job talk for a North American position, basically to replace Jimmy Griffin, was on seasonality at Olduvai Gorge, and they hired me anyways. I have no idea why. Again, I talked about dumb luck. Well, it was dumb luck. So then I had to face a class of advanced graduate students who could run circles around me about North American archaeology and lecture to them about North American archaeology. So I spent the summer before I actually started teaching, just reading everything I could find on North American archaeology. And the fastest way I found to break into a literature that I knew nothing about was to read dissertations, because dissertations are full of data, and most of which you can't publish ultimately. So it was a great way to get into it. And I mastered the literature, if you like, on Paleo-Indian. That's as far as I got when I started actually lecturing. And the students put up with it. I still get teased about it, that those poor grad students who took my North American archaeology and my first time teaching at the graduate level on the topic, we spent probably the first 6 or 8 weeks on Paleo-Indian because I didn't know anything else. At any rate, I also, at that point, Dick Ford was the director of the Museum of Anthropology, which was what housed, if you like, all of the archaeologists at Michigan. He said, you know, in order to get tenure, you need a serious project in North America. And of course, it was difficult because I was a Neanderthal specialist. And so I thought, now what would come closest to the Paleolithic? And that's Paleo-Indian. And that's the only thing I'd really read about on North America anyways. So I decided I had to find a Paleo-Indian bison kill. But that's not so easy. You don't just walk out somewhere into Western North America to people you don't know and say, hey, give me your best Paleo-Indian bison kill so I can dig it and get tenure. So I started by visiting a person who had been a student at the same time I was, and that's George Frizen in Wyoming. And I learned a great deal on that visit. I was with him for only a few days, but he was incredibly hospitable. But then I moved on to New Mexico. Having been an undergraduate there, I felt more comfortable there in general, and spent an entire summer before I actually set foot in Michigan looking for the Paleo-Indian bison kill. Now bear in mind, at that point I'd never had a course in faunal analysis either. So to put it bluntly, I didn't know a bison bone from a hole in the ground. But at any rate, a BLM archaeologist in Santa Fe took pity on me and said, go to Roswell, they just found a Paleo-Indian bison kill. So I went and looked, and there were a few bones hanging out of an arroyo. I wasn't sure if they were bison, but they were big. And I did find 2 or 3 flakes eroding out of the arroyo, so I thought, okay, I'll do a project. So when I actually showed up at Michigan to begin as a faculty member, I put in an internal grant. Thank God it was internal, because nobody externally would have ever funded this, to take a bunch of unsuspecting students to Roswell, New Mexico to excavate a Paleo-Indian bison kill. Well, the Paleo-Indian bison kill turned out to be dating to about AD 1450. At least they were bison. I wasn't even sure if they were cows that had died on the Chisholm Trail or were real bison. So again, dumb luck. It wasn't Paleo-Indian, but that's where it's at that point, and that was 1978, 77 and 78, that my career began to develop a real trajectory, again by dumb luck. And this story is, as I say, has kind of been dumb luck all the way through. I had written this paper in Science on seasonality in Olduvai Gorge. And at an SAA meeting, one of my superheroes, Glenn Isaac, who I'd never met before, came to me and said, I want to meet you at 5 o'clock at the hotel registration. And I got there, and for any of you who've been to an SAA meeting at 5 o'clock at the registration desk, you know it's a total zoo. And there was Glenn Isaac, and I was really shocked that he showed up. It was incredibly generous of him to do that. We then went to the nearest bar in the hotel, and sitting at a table right at the entrance to the bar was Lou Binford with a whole bunch of disciples. And they said, oh, hi, Glenn, it's great to see you. Come join us. And I thought, okay, that's the end of that meeting with Glenn Isaac. But Glenn said, no, I promised to talk to Speth, and I'm going to do it. And that was a real eye-opener. So we went to a table at the back of the bar, and he proceeded to compliment me on the seasonality paper, which actually in hindsight should never have been published, because it dealt with a topic on Olduvai fauna, and at that point I'd still never heard the word taphonomy. But he started out by complimenting me by saying, and actually elaborating, how important it was to raise the issue of seasonality, that very few people were talking about it. And then he said, you know, you ought to come to Africa and see for yourself. So I went to Kubi Fora with Glenn Isaac in 1979 while I was a North American archaeologist at Michigan, all right? So there's these two tracks here happening, neither one really going very far. But I always took Binford, his readings, his books, along as sort of something to flagellate myself with, and I took Nunavut ethnoarchaeology with me. And on the days off, I would lie in a dry wash on the Karari Escarpment and read Nunavut ethnoarchaeology, and I began to see a way of analyzing the bison kill. And when I got back, when I got back to Ann Arbor, during my days off and time off, I retired to an abandoned wind tunnel on campus where all the bison bones from the bison kill that I had excavated were stored. And I began analyzing them using utility indices from Binford's Nunavut stuff. And as fate would have it, there were beautiful patterns and absolutely diametrically opposite to anything I had learned from George Frizen about the way bison kills should behave. All of the Northern Plains kills that he had reported on, or most of them, were fall-winter kills of cows. The site I excavated in Roswell, New Mexico, turned out to be a spring kill and mostly bulls. I had no idea why. And so I began, sort of this proverbial business of beating my head against the wall to try to figure out why it was so different from Northern Plains bison kills. Why were they going after bulls? And I began, again, sort of anal compulsively, trying to sex every bone that I could. And I went to the Smithsonian and worked with comparative bison that they had in their collections to develop criteria to sex postcranial material. And a pattern began to emerge. I couldn't explain it initially, but it was really curious. I got the standard utility pattern that Binford found and others have found over and over again, often called a reverse utility or bulk utility curve, where at a kill they're throwing away the low utility stuff, removing all of the high utility stuff, but also removing a lot of the anatomical parts of the animals of kind of intermediate utility. They're removing much more of that than you might expect just based on its food value. But when I plotted the sex of males and females separately, to my surprise, they were throwing away a lot more of the females, and that made no sense. Why, if you'd already killed the animals, would you throw away usable meat and marrow and so forth? Again, I had a pattern but no explanation for it. And I began exploring, again, sort of randomly, not knowing where I was going, the wildlife literature, the ethnohistoric literature, explorer literature, hunter-gatherer literature, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge that has become central to a lot of what I've done since. This would have been around, let's say, 1980, 81. It's influenced a lot of what I've done since. It turns out that what they were throwing away, what these 1450 AD hunter-gatherers were throwing away, were body parts that were fat-depleted. These were body parts of females who were basically either pregnant or nursing. And so the next question was, what was wrong with fat-depleted meat? And I started talking to nutritionists, and this was during a period, late 70s, early 80s, when there was still the belief that malnutrition was caused by inadequate protein intakes. And what the ethnohistory was showing was that the real reason was there was a limit to how much protein you could eat, and above a certain level, roughly 35% of calories, it was toxic and actually could lead to death. And these hunters in Roswell at AD 1450 apparently knew this damn well. And if the parts were fat depleted, and there turned out to be a very orderly sequence of fat depletion, and the hunters clearly knew that very well. The first fat to go is under the skin. If the animal continues to be stressed because it's feeding a nursing calf and the forage is not greened up yet, they'll start to deplete the fat around the organs, and then they begin to deplete the fat in the marrow, and that starts closest to the body and then works its way distally towards the hoofs. And that's exactly the pattern that I was seeing in this bison kill. They were discarding female parts in direct proportion to the likelihood that they were fat depleted. So that began to open all kinds of interesting doors. And at that point, an Israeli archaeologist who was excavating a Neanderthal site in Israel, Ofer Bar Yosef, spent a sabbatical at Michigan, and he said, "I like this nutritional stuff you're doing. Come back to Israel and get back into Neanderthal stuff." So I did. And so I've been bouncing back and forth basically my entire career between Paleolithic and nutritional issues and working in the Southwest and with bison, but also focused very heavily on nutritional issues. In Israel, I started working with Ofer, not excavating, but analyzing the fauna from a well-known cave called Kibara Cave. It's on the Carmel, not far south of Haifa, and in fact only a few kilometers south of Tabun, where I started with Art Jelinek. So I was kind of back where I'd started from, although I spent most of my time in Jerusalem where the fauna was actually housed, and began looking at some of these same nutritional issues with Neanderthals, how they were dealing with their animal resources, what body parts they were keeping, what body parts they were discarding, and so forth. So that's been another direction that I've headed in. All right, so let's switch streams just a little bit now and kind of talk in more general terms about where all this has been leading me. As I've mentioned several times, there's been a lot of unplanned, what I've called dumb luck in the way this has unfolded. Perhaps the lesson for me in a lot of this is that, and it took me quite a while to come to recognize what was happening in my own life and how I felt comfortable working. It's had certain negative aspects as well, and I'll explain briefly what those are. But I think this also may be of interest to younger folks who are looking into the future to their career. I never knew, and I still don't know, where my career was going and where it is going now. I'm still writing, still getting new ideas, and if anything, I think it's accelerating. But it's just as blind now as it was then. And what's happened is this, that in the projects that have led to what I would consider interesting results, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here, but just those things which kind of turned me on, and I thought, oh, this is kind of cool and it's interesting, have always been counterintuitive. They have not been where I started. Now, the negative side of this is it's made it very difficult to write grants, to write grant proposals, because I basically have always had the feeling that I know it's not going to end up here. So if I list all these wonderful hypotheses, I always have this feeling that they're probably nonsense anyways, because I'm going to end up with something that is utterly counterintuitive, with the bison and the nutritional issues. I started with the assumption that bison hunting was mostly a fall-winter exercise targeting females. That was the going wisdom from Friesen and others when I started. I ended up with a bison kill that was a different season, targeting bulls instead of cows. It was also at a time when nutritionists were telling us that protein worldwide, the World Health Organization was part of this, that worldwide protein malnutrition was the world's #1 problem. And what this bison kill showed me was that the issue wasn't not enough protein, the issue was not enough fat. Protein actually was toxic in excess of a certain amount. And that was something that nutritionists initially that I talked to said, you're nuts. Even when I showed them, and I'm not exaggerating here, hundreds of ethnohistoric accounts, things as commonplace as the Lewis and Clark expedition, and many, many others like that. They're filled with the descriptions. Lewis and Clark, for example, in one of their winters in the bush, they say, we ran out of food, we were hungry. We sent a hunting party out. They killed 40 elk and 16 bison, but they were all too lean for use. When you start looking in the literature, it's filled with those kinds of statements. The reaction of the nutritionist was, you're nuts. They didn't know what they were talking about. Well, since then, the nutritionists have come to realize that the real problem with malnutrition is probably what is now called protein-calorie malnutrition. And the argument generally is if you get enough calories, you probably also are getting enough protein. So the picture has changed, and there is a recognition now that maybe there are potential problems with excess protein. And many of the other things that I have gotten into have reflected this same sort of counterintuitive nature. For example, in analyzing the bison kill, the one in Roswell, I made heavy use of Binford's utility indices. They were a real gold mine for me. They offered me a window that revealed patterning. It didn't explain the patterning, but it was extremely interesting, and ultimately it's what led me to these nutritional insights. Now, continuing in pursuing the ethnohistoric literature, I've come to realize that Binford was projecting Western food preferences in designing or interpreting the utility indices. Methodologically, they're very valuable. Their interpretation, I think, still has some serious problems. I didn't recognize these early on, but I do now. When you go into the ethnohistoric literature, and by that I mean accounts from the 1600s, 1700s, and early 1800s, the part that Binford assigned the highest utility, the femur, the hams, the thighs, because of the massive amount of meat on that part of the body, that is invariably the highest utility in Binford's utility indices. When you read these early accounts, guess what the northern Athabascans and Inuit call them? White man's food or dog food. They don't eat it because it has no fat. They don't like it. It has one nutritional or food use that's really important, but it's only one, and that is for making pemmican. That is, if you're going to mix dried meat with fat, the mix has to be about 25% protein and 75% fat. That's the normal mix for pemmican. It's dried meat, powdered, and then mixed with fat. But to get the meat dry, you need absolutely lean meat, and the ideal meat for that purpose is from the hams or thighs. If you're not making pemmican, or if you don't have enough fat in order to make pemmican, you basically either feed it to your dogs or you throw it away. And in the Paleolithic, if we're not dealing with domestic dogs, there's a good chance that our Paleolithic Neanderthals and probably upper Paleolithic humans threw away a lot of the highest, what we would consider, using Binford's interpretation, they would throw away a lot of the highest utility parts. Same thing with cut marks. Yes, cut marks on bones can be very informative, but the interpretation is not as straightforward as most of us tend to assume. If you want to get at the marrow, you're going to leave cut marks, filleting marks, to remove the muscle mass. But that doesn't mean you put the muscle in your mouth. They may well have thrown it away in order to get at the marrow. So the way zooarchaeologists interpret the cut mark frequencies and so forth, and invariably say, well, we have lots of filleting marks, meat was really important in the diet. That's not necessarily true. It may be true, but it's not necessarily true. So let me broaden the insight that at least this has given me. And it complicates life, but it also makes it very interesting. And to do this, let's go back to the heyday of the new archaeology. I got my degree, my graduate degree at Michigan during the heyday of the new archaeology. Binford had already left there. Binford was a graduate student at Michigan, but he had just left before I got there. But needless to say, the new archaeology was alive and well, very much so at Michigan. And I couldn't tell you why, but at the time I felt really uneasy about it. And it's taken my entire career to figure out what was wrong. The two books came out at the same time, or more or less the same time. One was New Perspectives in Archaeology by Binford and Binford, Lou and Sally, and Man the Hunter by Lee and DeVore. I loved Man the Hunter and fell asleep with New Perspectives. It was the most boring book I could imagine. But I didn't know why, and I felt kind of like a Martian at Michigan in that sense. The new archaeology was there was something wrong or missing with it. As time went on, I realized that too much of the emphasis was on testing and not on what you were testing. And there are a number of archaeologists in the 70s and 80s that made this quite explicit. Patty Jo Watson, for example, wrote that it doesn't matter where the hypothesis comes from. What really matters is how it fares in testing. And my reaction to that is garbage in, garbage out. In other words, if your hypothesis is garbage, why bother testing it? The result's probably equifinality anyways. That was the number one lesson, but it probably took me 30 years to figure that out. It's not that testing is unimportant, but to me, the assumptions that you work with are really the most critical thing. And I had a lot of problems serving on NSF panels. Problems in the sense that I got frustrated with myself, because usually the assumptions are laid out on page 1 with 2 or 3 paragraphs of bandwagon, and then everything else is test, 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 and often no alternative hypotheses. So what happens if you falsify? You just never hear about the results. So everybody already knows what they want, and they know they're going to find it. So why bother doing it in the first place? What was really interesting to me was the assumptions. So this brings me back to this whole issue of how to go about this. To me, and I admit here that my views on this are unorthodox, and I'm probably, my favorite expression is to say a lot of my ideas are more than 3 standard deviations from the mean. The real critical thing is what Alison Wiley called the source side, that is the assumptions. And the other side, the testing, is the subject side. And to me, the most interesting part is the source side. And here is the unorthodox part. And a lot of people kind of look at me like I'm from another planet when I say this. Basically, without ethnohistory, or let's make it more general, without the living world, we have nothing. You don't even know a bone is a bone without reference to a living animal. You don't know a flake is a flake without reference to living stone tools, that is to the living world, and that people actually smash rocks and get things that you call flakes off of. There's no mobility in the archaeological record. There's no food sharing. There's no storage. There's no seasonality. There's no hunting. There's no nothing but stuff, if you want to put it bluntly, a bunch of stuff with 3-dimensional coordinates. That's what the archaeological record basically amounts to. And that, frankly, is pretty damn boring. And what really counts is diving into the living world. Now, immediately people say, well, you can't just project the present into the past. True, I wholeheartedly agree. But you can't do anything without reference to the living world, as far as I'm concerned. So the question is not whether, but how. And much of my career has slowly and steadily focused more and more on the source side, that is, going into the ethnohistory, to try to understand, for example, why would people throw away animals they had killed? Why would they throw away the hams, the meatiest part of a carcass? On and on and on. I could go on with many other examples. The whole business of logistical mobility. It's a bandwagon in archaeology. We're constantly looking at logistical mobility. It came out of Binford's work with the Nunavut and a 2-week visit to the Aluwara in Australia. And it's become dogma throughout the archaeological profession. And everything, we're trying to figure out logistical mobility and embedded procurement of lithics. It's always done in the subsistence, in the context of subsistence. You look at the ethnohistory and it doesn't work that way. Over and over and over again, the ethnohistoric record suggests that prior to the introduction, let's say with the Nunavut, where Binford did most of his work, prior to the introduction of the dog sled and dog breeds large enough to pull those dog sleds, which were introduced largely by the Hudson Bay Company in the 1700s, women did all of the transport, or most of the transport. And it's staggering to read these early accounts from the 1600s of women literally dragging loads of 180 pounds all day long and over huge distances. They did all the paddling of the canoes, or most of it. They did a lot of the loading and unloading of the canoes. They carried most of the stuff over the portages. The early accounts said, well, women were nothing but slaves. If you read some of the more recent interpretations by First Nation peoples or Native Americans, you find a rather different interpretation. There were different spheres of influence. The job of the man was to kill the animal and provide the raw materials. The job of the woman, the animal became her business from the moment it died onward. She's the one who turned the animal from raw materials into life-sustaining clothing, food, and shelter. And that included transporting it. So now I'm not trying to introduce a universal law or generalization to replace Binford's ideas about logistical mobility. But the ethnohistory suggests the picture is a lot more complex. And this is sort of where my whole career has been headed, is going back into the source side, not to find new laws, new generalizations that you can hammer into every archaeological assemblage, whether it's Neanderthal or Paleo-Indian, but to try to understand the variability and some of the sources of that variability. Why were people doing this? How were they doing it? And so forth. And to me, that has been the major lesson. It has made life difficult, because I have great difficulty writing grant proposals, because I know damn well that no matter what I write when I start, I'm not going to believe a word of it when I get to the end. And that makes it very hard to be honest and actually write the stuff when I know that it's probably BS from day one. So what I often rather do is to start and dive into something until I figure it out. Once I've figured it out, there's not much of an incentive to write a grant proposal anymore. But it's been really, really interesting, and the number of problems that one can get into are infinite. One of the recent projects now that I've been looking at is the role of putrid meat in human diet. It turns out that putrefaction, contrary to popular beliefs, is actually one of the most effective ways of doing basically what cooking does, but without fire. And it makes it, by reducing, it creates a microhabitat for lactobacilli that basically inhibits the germination of spores of botulism so that it's not pathological. And when you ask, or when you see early travelers asking Native Americans or Inuit or others, how can you eat something that stinks like this? Their answer is very simple: we don't eat the smell. And when they're eating food that has been rotting for half a year and it's full of maggots, the answer is, well, you eat the meat and the maggots eat the meat, so why not eat the maggots? And it turns out that it basically, the process of putrefaction breaks down the proteins into amino acids. It preserves or prevents the fats from going rancid. It lowers the pH and prevents botulism and other pathogens from invading. It requires no supervision. You basically, one of the most common ways of dealing with it, you simply immerse it in a pond and come back 3 months later and eat it. It also, in Arctic environments, it's absolutely critical for preserving vitamin C. Vitamin C becomes unstable above about a pH of 3.5 or 4, but with lactobacilli and fermentation or putrefaction, it lowers the pH to about 2.5 or even lower, so the vitamin C is preserved, and you're not cooking it so that you don't destroy the vitamin C that way. So it turns out it's a vital, I think, an absolutely vital part of northern adaptations, and probably was vital to Neanderthal and Upper Paleolithic adaptations. It's blatantly visible in the ethnohistoric literature. You just have to go look for it. So there are endless problems like this that can be resolved. And I guess the message, or one of the messages of this as an archaeologist, I would spend, and I'm going to make up a number here, I would spend more than half your time in ethnohistory and not in site reports, counting and weighing and measuring flakes. They're boring as hell. But get into the ethnohistory and you'll find that there are so many questions just screaming at you, and answers, or at least possible directions for exploring all kinds of interesting questions. I talked already a little bit about my interest in fermented or putrid meat in northern environments, and how important it is and was in the past, and its incredible role as a way of, in a sense, cooking food without fire. It does all the same things that cooking does, as well as preserving the vitamin C. But I want to comment briefly on how I got into that, why I got interested in that in the first place. It goes back to my Neanderthal interests. There's a debate going on, it has been for quite a while, and it's still very much alive and well, about whether Neanderthals controlled fire. They certainly had fire. There are lots of Middle Paleolithic or Neanderthal sites with deposits of ash and hearths and so forth. So there's no question that they did use fire. But there are also sites where there is very little or no evidence of fire. Not only no ash and no burned bone, but not even any crazed or pot-lidded lithics, flakes that would suggest accidental burning. And including in areas that were close to the ice sheets in France and so forth. And that has led to a quite hot debate, no pun intended, about whether or not Neanderthals actually were able to make fire and control it, or whether they simply were dependent on lightning strikes or something of that nature to occasionally get fire. And in thinking about this, I began to wonder, how could Neanderthals, who are often thought of as top carnivores, heavily dependent on meat, how would they survive without fire? Now, that led me to the Arctic. Obviously, in the Arctic, there are lots and lots of reports of Inuit and Athabascans and others in subarctic and Arctic eating frozen or semi-frozen raw meat. And so, it's possible that's what Neanderthals did. But there are other aspects of Neanderthal life that are problematic. There's virtually no fire-cracked rock in the Middle Paleolithic. Another interesting problem, and led to another research target of mine. When you look at modern hunter-gatherers in northern latitudes, they all boil. And it's routine to boil crushed bone or broken up bone to boil the grease out. And it's been assumed by archaeologists that, of course, you could only boil in perishable containers, that is, in pre-ceramic periods. You could only do that with heated stones. Well, again, if you go into the ethnohistoric literature, you find people all over the place boiling directly over a fire with birch bark and with leaves and other things, and not using heated stones. So that's a myth in archaeology that everybody else seems to know, including Jean Auel in her book Clan of the Cave Bears. When you read her acknowledgments, she learned that from wilderness survivalists, not from archaeologists. We were the last ones to know about this. So it is possible that Neanderthals were boiling fat out of bones using perishable containers. Unfortunately, we have no direct evidence of that yet. But until you ask the question, nobody's going to bother looking and trying to find out whether, in fact, maybe they were boiling without using heated stones. So hopefully people will begin to look for alternative ways of discovering that, but without having to depend on the presence of heated stones. But at any rate, I got interested in how Neanderthals could deal with a raw meat diet. Was all of their food eaten frozen or raw and during warmer months unfrozen? It's difficult to chew that stuff. And there's all this literature about Neanderthals and their high energetic needs. And it's very energetic, requires a lot of energy to metabolize meat, and even more energy to metabolize raw meat. It's very expensive. And if Neanderthals are living on the edge calorically, then a raw meat diet would be even more problematic. So I began to wonder, is there an alternative? And being a nice zooarchaeologist who picks dead carcasses up, or who used to pick up dead carcasses off of roads, particularly or often in southern Arizona in midsummer, you realize that when a carcass really gets rotted, it can partially liquefy. And I began to get interested in what was actually happening in a carcass as it putrefies. Now again, just like the study of protein and fat that I described with the bison kill, a lot of this was kind of blind searching. I didn't know what the answer was. I just was curious. So one of the things I started looking at was the travel accounts, early explorer accounts, and what they encountered in the Arctic. And lo and behold, they were constantly being disgusted by what they observed in the Arctic. Euro-Americans, that is, whether they were from the US or whether they were from Europe, depending on the time period and so forth, they were into steaks. I mean, and we still are. And I've already mentioned this with regard to utility indices. That's what we think is important in a carcass, are the nice big hunks of meat, the tenderloins, the sirloins, and so forth. And these explorers and missionaries and others were sort of horrified that what the northern First Nation peoples and Athabascans and so forth were eating were mostly the innards, the intestines, the testicles, the eyes, the brain, the kidneys, the heart, the liver, and they were feeding them the good stuff, the muscles, to their dogs. They're just throwing it away. But on top of that, they were rotting a lot of it deliberately. And there were certain methods that they used over and over again. And one of the delicacies is still today called stinkhead. And it's where you take fish heads and you bury them and you rot them, and you may do it for several months in a special, often plant-lined pit. And they may be in there for 2 or 3 months. And the early descriptions are that you can eat them kind of like soft ice cream. These heads, even the bones become really soft. And the Europeans were disgusted by it, and then it was a real delicacy. Another standard fare was the fermented stomach contents of caribou. They loved it. They often deliberately fermented it even further. They would take the stomach with its contents and add things like the liver and the kidneys and the heart and everything else, toss it all in, pour in some blood, and then hang it up and let it rot for a few weeks and then eat it. Sometimes they'd first freeze it, then slice it, and then eat it. There were a lot of ways of preparing it. But some of the most graphic were an explorer in Greenland named Perry in the late 19th century had an Inuit who asked him to stop his boat because he wanted to retrieve a seal that he had left somewhere. And so this Inuit disappears for a while. And then Perry notes that this incredible stench started reaching the boat while he was waiting, long before he saw the Inuit returning. This incredible stench of rotten meat. And then finally around the corner came this Eskimo with this huge seal across his shoulders, totally rotten. And at each step, the way Perry describes it, it was raining maggots. And Perry made him throw it out, and he didn't want to, and the Inuit was really angry about it and made it quite clear that this was an absolute delicacy. And of course, to Perry, it was the most disgusting thing he'd ever seen. Stephanson, an ethnographer who worked a lot in the Arctic in the early 20th century, also described how people that were not Anglos, who were not used to rotten meat, when they were served a nice dish full of maggots, would step out of the tent or the igloo or wherever they were and as quietly as possible throw up in the bushes somewhere before they came in. And when it came to the stench, the Europeans would ask an elderly Inuit, how can you eat something that stinks that badly? And the Inuit would just look at him and say, we don't eat the smell. And it's really interesting. This got me into the disgust literature. And for generations, it's been assumed that the disgust reaction to maggots and to putrid meat and fish and so forth was hardwired, and the usual explanation is it protects you from infants from ingesting toxic substances. Well, lo and behold, more recent research suggests that it's actually a learned behavior that these infants don't learn until about somewhere between the age of 5 and 9. And before that age, they'll put anything in their mouth. It doesn't matter what it is. And the reaction to putrid meat depends entirely on what when you're an infant, what your closest caregivers are eating. And it's not hardwired at all. So again, when I supplied a lot of these references to psychologists who are studying disgust, they were amazed that they were thinking that maybe it's not hardwired. But again, when you get out of, if your study samples are only, let's say, American college students, you're not going to learn much about the origins of disgust. But when you start incorporating the ethnohistoric record of peoples like hunter-gatherers who are totally different from your average American college student, you start to see things that are totally counterintuitive. So the arrow goes both ways. You can learn a lot about the prehistoric record, but you can also learn a lot about human nutrition, a lot about things like the disgust response, and I think the pendulum is swinging in the study of in the psychological study of disgust to the recognition that the ability to express disgust is probably hardwired, but what elicits it is probably largely cultural, which is kind of interesting. And again, the insights for this came straight out of the ethnohistoric literature.